This is BBC Two for the Eastern Counties. Now John Stapleton reports on the disturbing story of a convicted murderer whose case has aroused controversy ever since he was sent to prison 13 years ago.
Paul Alexander Cleeland, you have been found guilty of murder. Is there anything you have to say to me before the sentence of the court is passed upon you?
Your Honour, I am innocent.
Paul Alexander Cleeland, the jury have found you guilty of murder. The sentence of the court upon you is that you go to prison for life. And I recommend the Secretary of State that you be not released upon license for a minimum period of 20 years.
Paul Cleeland was sent to prison 13 years ago. He was convicted of shooting a friend after they'd fallen out following a fight. He's been behind bars ever since. But the case of Paul Cleeland is not a simple story of crime and punishment. Some people believe he may be innocent. Others think doubts over his imprisonment are so serious they can only be settled by reopening the case.
We may well have imprisoned an innocent man for now well over 10 years, and that it's incumbent upon a system that claims to be a system of justice to ensure that he is rightly there, and he's there because he's committed this crime. I'm very doubtful whether he did.
Cleeland may well have known about it, but I'm pretty certain that he was not the one that pulled the trigger.
And I can only speak from a scientific point of view. It seems to me that the scientific evidence hasn't really been properly explained or exhaustively pursued, and on those grounds alone, the reinvestigation seems the only fair outcome.
There is nothing that really leads you to the conclusion that Paul Cleeland is definitely guilty of killing Clark in Stevenage on that particular night. I just don't believe that anybody looking at that evidence would convict somebody of murder.
Such doubts over Cleeland's continued imprisonment are prompted by several disturbing questions. Did the police get the right gun? This is the murder weapon. Or is it? Why were Cleeland's prison records changed? Innocent error, or were they tampered with to discredit him? The forensic evidence, was it conclusive enough? And why was one test not carried out at all? And why have the Home Office suppressed a report that could shed important new light on the case? Even a former Home Office minister has been forbidden to see it. Stevenage, where the murder took place, and the home of Paul Cleeland and the victim Terry Clark. They were friends, despite a violent argument 2 years before Clark's death. They worked together as painter and scaffolder. They were also members of the local underworld. Both had prison records and were well known to the police. Cleeland had already served Borstal and prison terms for assault and breaking and entering. Twice married with 4 children, he wed his second wife on the day he was released from a prison sentence. His relationship with the police, not surprisingly, was an uneasy one. He was regarded as a troublemaker, and following Clark's murder, he was taken in for questioning almost immediately. Cleeland and Clark weren't only business acquaintances, they were partners in crime as well. In 1966, they were accused of breaking into a dress shop in the centre of Stevenage. They were cleared because of a dispute over the police evidence. On the night Cleeland was accused of killing Clark, on November the 5th, 1972, he claimed he was at home in bed with his wife. It was an alibi the jury didn't believe. What isn't contested, however, is that on the 2 previous days he had met and talked with Clark on friendly terms. Graceway, Stevenage, where Terry Clark lived and died in what everyone agrees was a calculated and planned killing. Clark was returning home with his ex-wife, with whom he'd been reconciled. They'd been to a nightclub together. In the back seat, a friend who was too drunk to recall the horrifying events that followed. The official police record of what happened next. Clark parked his Jaguar. He was shot as he got out, first in the back, and then fatally in the chest. His ex-wife didn't recognize the killer. She described him as about 5 feet 8 and dark. Cleeland is nearly 6 feet tall and fair. Barry Dack was the first reporter on the scene. He's convinced Cleeland was too clever to have waited in ambush here.
Somebody who was known in this area would not have lurked in the shadows in the dead of night, not knowing when his prey was going to come home. Cleeland isn't a stupid man. He just wouldn't have been silly enough to just really risk being recognised. The rumour that came out, and that one stuck really ever since, that Clark was due to appear at Stevenage Magistrates Court later that week. He was on various criminal charges as well as motoring charges, and that he had decided that he was not going to take the rap himself and that he was going to involve and implicate other people. Those people felt that, you know, the only thing they could do was to get Clark out of the way, and consequently hatched this plan to kill him.
Such suggestions were scorned by the police. Cleeland was charged, and more than 5 months later, he appeared at St Albans Crown Court accused of murder. The trials that followed were almost as sensational as the crime itself. Cleeland sacked his barristers soon after the hearing began. He complained that they weren't critical enough of the police. Instead, he defended himself from the dock, a layman taking on the lawyers. A decision many people felt was madness. The court was told by the prosecution that the main evidence against Cleeland came from witnesses who claimed they'd supplied him with a gun and cartridges. The jury weren't convinced. When they remained divided, the judge ordered a retrial. Cleeland's second trial ended in conviction, but he may be innocent, says his former MP. A lawyer could have helped prove it.
I think it's very tough to represent yourself. Cleeland's a clever and articulate man, but he's not a lawyer. It is a tragedy that he insisted on representing himself, and a tragedy for which he's paying, I think, extremely heavily. He did himself very little good. But there do seem to have been, in the case, occasions when either something that was quite glaringly an anomaly between the evidence that was put forward in the court and what subsequently emerged to be the case was never pursued, never resolved. There have been inquiries which have never been made public, and ones which I believe would reveal some quite disturbing evidence.
As chief reporter of the local newspaper, Barry Dack covered the trials. He'd had misgivings about the case since the night of the murder. His doubts increased as the trials unfolded. And when Cleeland was sentenced, Dack hinted at a possible miscarriage of justice in a story for his newspaper. Two of the main prosecution witnesses were criminals like Cleeland and self-confessed drug addicts. Cleeland, Dack believes, never properly tested their evidence.
I've always felt that Cleeland was involved in some way or knew more about it than he was telling. But then the same goes for a lot of the witnesses. And I really don't think the truth came out at either trials. There's so many questions that really need to be answered and still haven't been answered 13 years afterwards.
From the prison cell at Wandsworth, where he began his life sentence, Cleeland still protested his innocence. He's continued to do so ever since. The question marks raised by the conviction and the information that's emerged since have disturbed not only Cleeland's MP, Shirley Williams, but her successor, Conservative Bowen Wells. With the aid of forensic and ballistics evidence, they fought for years to have the case reopened. The biggest question mark is over this, the alleged murder weapon, an elderly and unusual shotgun. Cleeland was said by the prosecution to have been sold such a gun, but the man who sold it at first denied ever owning the gun. His statement to police said he'd given it not to Paul Cleeland, but to Terry Clark, a slip of the pen that was corrected. But the biggest disparity is over the gruesome shot pattern. Clark was said to have been shot from a maximum range of 18 feet, much less according to his ex-wife. Dr. Julius Grant, one of the country's leading forensic scientists, has analysed the prosecution's claim and that of the defence. The defence said that if fired from 18 feet, the alleged murder weapon would have caused a vastly different shot pattern. A discrepancy which Dr. Grant finds deeply disturbing.
As far as the ballistics aspect is concerned, and I refer, of course, to the shooting experiments, to put it in common language, the variation between the results obtained by different people is quite astonishing, bearing in mind the conditions under which the tests were made and the standing of the people concerned.
John Rothery was one of those ballistics experts. He test-fired the Guy Moncrief shotgun said to have killed Clark. First, from the 18 feet alleged by the prosecution's own firearms expert. At such close range, the pellets tore into the target in a deadly but dense formation. Yet the shots that killed Terry Clark were widely spread over his whole body, as well as the car from which he'd emerged. To achieve a similar shot pattern, John Rothery had to retreat to a distance of nearly 40 feet, a long and risky distance for a killer whose victim would be shrouded by darkness. This time, the pattern resembled a fatal wound. Rothery was supported by another gunsmith who tested the shotgun and produced similar results, and a consultant pathologist who examined the victim's wounds reached the same conclusion. So who was right? In summing up, the judge told the jury Clark had been killed at close range.
If the victim was shot at a distance of 18 feet, as the prosecution claimed, then the Moncrief gun was not used. And if the Moncrief gun was used, then it was fired at a distance of between 38 and 44 feet.
So was the Guy Moncrief the gun that killed Terry Clark? Certainly was an odd choice for a cold-blooded killer. Old, in very poor condition, and according to ballistics expert John Rothery, almost too dangerous to even test fire. So, could it have been this then? A sawn-off shotgun, the underworld's favourite weapon? And if so, who pulled the trigger?
Guy Fawkes Night, 1972. As the fireworks exploded, a more deadly affair was about to unfold. From his underworld contacts, Paul Cleeland claims to have discovered why Clark was killed and by whom. This is his version. According to Cleeland, it amounted to an execution. The murder weapon was not the Guy Moncrief, but a sawn-off shotgun, and the murderer, a member of a London mob. Clark was about to become a police informer. 2 days before he died, he'd appeared in court on a hotel robbery charge and faced a heavy prison sentence. He had to be silent. The time, 2 a.m. Clark and his ex-wife Pat had been to a nightclub in Bedfordshire 20 miles away. He was due back in court a few days later, a date he was never to keep. He was wounded by the first shot and killed by the second. The killer made off, leaving Pat Clark to comfort her dying husband. The gun, it's claimed, was later thrown into a weir at Harlow. The police took a different view. They brought the suspected murder weapon, the Guy Moncrief shotgun, to the Metropolitan Police Forensic Laboratory at Holborn for testing. The tests on Cleeland's clothes as well as the gun were to prove controversial and the subject of a prolonged courtroom argument. The police test-fired the Guy Moncrief and came to the conclusion that 18 feet was the fatal distance, a decision later to be hotly contested. Some unfired cartridges were also found in the area, but they couldn't be scientifically linked with Cleeland. It was a different story with tests on his coat. They showed traces of lead and could, said the police, have come from a gun. Other experts take a different view.
Lead is a very ubiquitous element that's found everywhere, very common. Lead piping, for example, merely rubbing against a lead pipe would transfer sufficient lead to clothing to enable it to be detected in the method that was used. I understand that the defendant worked with paint. I think if he was in the habit of using paint, it would be surprising if it didn't occur on his clothing somewhere, assuming he was wearing his everyday clothes at the time.
So did the lead on Cleeland's clothes come from a gun? This machine could have settled all the arguments. It was never used. The scanning electron microscope can distinguish between lead from the environment, such as paint, and that from a gun. The test existed in 1972, although it wasn't in wide use. There was such a machine, however, at Scotland Yard. The police say that at the time it wasn't being used to test lead deposits from firearms.
There were these tests available. They were sophisticated tests. If Mr. Cleeland's clothing and the clothing of the victim had been subjected to those tests as they could have been, we would have had a much clearer ground on which to base a conclusion about the innocence or guilt of this man who's now served more than a decade in prison.
The forensic tests at Holborn also produced another inconsistency that's never been resolved. According to a senior detective, some of the evidence, including the cartridges, was brought here for testing on the same day that Cleeland was charged with murder. The officer said he delivered them to the laboratory personally.
The police officer said he brought the cartridges here to the police laboratory on November the 7th, 2 days after the murder. There were 2 spent cartridges from the Guy Moncrief gun and 18 others found not far away. He also brought part of the gun. Yet another police officer, the police photographer, said that on the very same day he had the gun and the cartridges 30 miles away at Stevenage. And these are the actual photographs of the gun and the cartridges he took on that very same day. Now, during the trial, both police officers stuck to their story, and so this contradiction remains a mystery.
By this time, Paul Cleeland had been taken back to Stevenage police station for questioning. Detectives had briefly detained him earlier that day, when he chatted at the station with Clark's widow. She'd seen the killer, but not recognised him.
It was down here to the cells beneath the police station that Cleeland was brought. And what went on here that first night was to prove a crucial and controversial part of the police case. So the police claim that while in his cell, they heard Cleeland confess the murder to another prisoner.
Listen, Paul, I think they're going to charge me with the murder. I'm not having it.
I don't care what you have. You just sit there and keep your mouth shut because you don't know nothing.
Oh, they're getting on to you. They're going to have you, baby.
It's down to me, not you. Don't breathe a word.
If it's not you, you've got nothing to worry about.
They can't prove it's me.
They can.
They can't. You put my name up and I'll do you. Keep your mouth shut. Have you made a statement?
Not yet. I haven't signed it.
You sign that and you'll get the same as the other man.
Cleeland has always denied holding such an incriminating conversation. And one has to wonder, would Cleeland, a streetwise crook, well acquainted with police methods, really have taken such an extraordinary risk? Fallen for what he himself described in court as the oldest trick in the book.
I don't think anybody can believe the confession in prison with somebody in the next door cell overhearing a conversation between 2 people who've not got blameless records, both Cleeland and his conversationalist. Here you have Paul Cleeland, who himself is not a blameless character by any stretch of the imagination, and an equally a man of similar character in 2 cells. Both of them experienced, therefore, in the criminal world and of police methods. To suggest that those 2 would exchange intimate conversations about a forthcoming trial is to stretch the imagination a little bit far.
At Wandsworth Prison, after his conviction, Cleeland discovered what he considered to be disturbing new evidence about that confession. He learned of another prisoner who'd been in the cell block at Stevenage that night and had apparently heard nothing of what the police said was a lengthy confession. But when Cleeland applied to interview the prisoner, named Nash, about the events in the cell block, he discovered to his amazement that all his prison records showed he'd already had such a meeting with Nash.
If Cleeland had met Nash here at Wandsworth, as the prison record stated, they could have faced allegations at the appeal that the two of them had concocted a story to secure Cleeland's release. In fact, the prison records were wrong. Cleeland had met someone else here at Wandsworth. He never met Nash at all. It took several months to prove this, and Cleeland claimed that the records had been deliberately tampered with to discredit Nash as a witness. He was supported in this by a senior prison officer from another jail who investigated the affair and who concluded that these discrepancies could not have been caused by innocent error.
When we came up with this irrefutable evidence that the 5 prison records, all of which said the same thing, that a man called Nash had visited Cleeland, which subsequently turned out to be untrue, and the odds against that being done without any systematic attempt to do it are, I think, mind-bending. They are tremendous odds. When we came forward to the Home Office with this evidence, we found a complete reluctance to accept that there had been not only a mistake, but possibly a forgery.
Cleeland also complained to the Home Office, who investigated the allegations and confirmed that according to the records, Cleeland had met Nash. Later they changed their minds and said the mistake was caused by a clerical error.
To this day, we have never had any satisfactory answer at all to how there came to be 5 incorrect prison records on the same day about the same man with the same name, and I can only leave it to other people to imagine how that could possibly happen, except by careful thought and indeed careful organisation beforehand.
He has managed to prove that in this case records were altered, prison records were altered, and evidence therefore was changed in order to help incriminate him. And there's no doubt about that. And that, of course, throws doubt on a lot of the other evidence brought against him.
The contradiction over the prison records was raised by Cleeland when he took his case to the Court of Appeal in 1976. But the court accepted the Home Office explanation of a clerical error and dismissed Nash's evidence. They said it was a case of 2 cunning criminals concocting a story. Not surprisingly, Cleeland's family have always stood by him. His mother has lobbied MPs and other public figures in an effort to have the case reopened. Meanwhile, her son's room has remained unchanged since his imprisonment 13 years ago, and his letters home have not changed either. They reflect Cleeland's determination and despair.
I reached the stage last year when it all seemed so pointless, and at that time I would have welcomed death with open arms. But in me I have a stubborn streak which I inherited from you, thank God. I have always been a fighter, and have learned it is only when you begin to doubt yourself that you lose any fight. You must accept that you're going to get hurt. Take your opponent's best blows, but don't show the pain. Your only goal is to win at any cost. Victory will be the painkiller.
The campaign to have the case re-examined has won support not only from MPs but from journalists. The Times newspaper argued for a retrial, and New Statesman writer Simon North has expressed even stronger doubts in a series of stories. North firmly believes Cleeland was wrongly imprisoned. He's sceptical of the police motive for the murder, a fight 2 years previously. Since then, Cleeland and Clark had worked together, and Cleeland was a frequent visitor to Clark's home.
The police suggested the motive for the killing was an argument that had occurred 2 years before between Clark and Cleeland over Clark's wife. But in fact, Clark and Cleeland had been social friends since then. They'd worked together as builder and decorator. And so it seems to me there's no credibility in that claim.
I don't think, from reports that I've heard of the row between the two of them, that it was sufficient enough to create venom in Cleeland's mind to actually want to go out and kill Clark. That's something which, again, has never really held water with me.
I think for somebody to have been in prison for that length of time, with the number of doubts that there are about his guilt, is a great tragedy and an indictment, really, of the judicial system as it exists at the moment. I think what we're getting is by comparison to America or Sweden, is second-rate justice, and I think that's a cause for concern for all of us.
The Home Office finally bowed to renewed pressure and allowed an investigation into some of the question marks over the case, particularly the prison records dispute. It was carried out by the then Assistant Chief Constable of Northamptonshire, Eldred Boothby, who conducted an independent inquiry. Among the people he talked to was Cleeland himself. He sent his report to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who concluded that there was insufficient evidence to proceed further. To this day, that report has remained secret, although the Home Office is under no obligation to make it public. They've resisted repeated calls to make an exception in this case.
I had been a Home Office minister. Indeed, I was in charge of prisons. I had been a Privy Councillor. I had been a Cabinet Minister for 6 years. One would have thought that was a pretty fair list of qualifications for looking at what? A police inquiry by an assistant constable of one authority about a case in another authority. But I was not permitted to see that inquiry report, even though I asked 3 Home Secretaries if I might do so. I have no idea what is in it. The fact that it's being kept so totally under wraps, I don't believe anybody else has seen what's in it either, suggests that it may well have things in it that the Home Office doesn't want people to know.
I think the public at large have got to be convinced that those who've been locked up as a result of trials, for murder in particular, but other crimes as well, are properly in prison serving a sentence imposed on them for the crimes they've committed.
In 1982, the campaign to have the Cleeland case reopened reached the House of Commons. Shirley Williams and Bowen Wells put aside their political differences to plead for a review. By now, Cleeland had been in jail for 10 years, and the MPs argued that it was not in the interest of justice for so many questions to remain unanswered. The Home Office disagreed and turned down their plea for a review.
Paul Cleeland is now in Gartree Maximum Security Prison in Leicestershire. 13 years after his conviction, he's still a Category A prisoner, the most closely guarded. Cleeland claims that's because he's been branded a troublemaker for continuing to contest the court's verdict. From his cell, prisoner 115354 persists with his story. But then Britain's jails are full of men protesting their innocence whose guilt is beyond doubt. In the strange case of Paul Cleeland, some people believe those doubts remain and must be dispelled.
We believe, on the evidence available to us, that any fair-minded judge would say that it's got to be retried. But at the moment, the public is left in a very bad position where any layman cannot be certain that this man is guilty and properly in prison for the crime that he has committed. And that is a position which I believe to be highly unsatisfactory and must be changed somehow.
If it's a question of assessing guilt or innocence on expert evidence of a scientific nature, I feel that the last word hasn't been said.
The doubt that I had when I knew that it was Paul Cleeland who had been arrested and charged with the murder remain 13 years later.
What I would say is that the case which I have lived with now for 14 years is one that raises such colossal doubts in my mind and the mind of other people who got to know about it, that I think the argument for not having a retrial is non-existent, and that a decent government, a decent Home Secretary, and I hope we have a decent Home Secretary, would now believe that this case should be retried.
At the moment, there's little prospect of that happening. Meanwhile, Paul Cleeland faces another 7 years behind bars for a crime he may not have committed.